very excited about this particular speaker, Dr. Stephen Haig Hawks. I've seen him talk a number of times, and his knowledge and enthusiasm for history, is, in particular Alaska history, is just absolutely astounding. And he has a way of spinning a yarn that's pretty fascinating. He's also authored a number of books that I highly encourage you to read, that you'll find quite entertaining, I'm sure. And I guess the thing that is most striking is Dr. Haig Hawks is a professor emeritus from UAA. He's taught over 40 years. And one of his students from 1975 is actually in the room. So I guess it's come full circle. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Haig Hawks and the 150th 101. Dr. Haig Hawks.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Hal. It's a real delight to be here, a real pleasure. Is that better? You hear? So, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation. It's very ambitious, the series of speakers you've put together, and the commitment you've made to commemorating the Sesquicentennial. You have my absolute admiration for that. I think it's just terrific, and thank you all for coming to hear my remarks, and I hope that you will all hear the remarks of the other people who come as well. Sesquicentennial 101. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of studying Alaska history for a long time, as Hal suggested. History is the study of the meaning of past human thought and action. So for Sesquicentennial 101, it's the meaning of what happened 150 years ago that I find most important, and that I think is the most interesting. It's apparent to me that history matters. It matters in many, many ways. It explains a great deal of what happens in the present, as I'm sure you all appreciate. And it's apparent to me that what really happened is always more complex than the highly visible markers that we use to recall the past. Of course, in the case of Sesquicentennial 101, the most important and obvious marker is the ceremony that took place on the hill over there on October the 18th, 1867. But I want to give an overview of that. To understand the meaning of the U.S. purchase of Alaska, I think I need to go behind that ceremony, quite a ways behind that ceremony, to see what made it happen. Why a Siberian line battalion and a detachment of the U.S. 9th Army wound up in Sitka, Alaska in October 1867, participating in a ritual devised by diplomats half a planet away in each direction. I have found the beginnings and the context of that event in two different stories. One, Russia's decision to liquidate its holdings in North America. The other one, which is really quite separate and in a way is an interesting intersection. The other story is the United States' decision to acquire Russian America. And the stories really are very different, and the motivations aren't related. They just happen to come together at that point in time. And I find that quite fascinating. So story one, the reason for Russia's decision to liquidate its holdings in North America. The conclusion, and I think that most of you are quite familiar with that conclusion, is that they found that they could no longer defend it, that it was too vulnerable. If somebody had decided that they wanted to take it, the Russians had learned that they wouldn't be able to stop that. And they wanted to avoid that embarrassment before it might happen. But there's a great deal that lies even behind that. And And I think the most important part of it is the Russian conception of what they were doing here in North America. And I think that we get a good beginning, a good start on that. Looking at Shelikof's, let's see if I can bring up Mr. Shelikof here. There, oops, we went too far. Of course, the problem with all of these 18th century guys wearing wigs is they all look alike. But this is supposed to be a rendering of Grigory Shelikof. As you know, he established the first, what would become the first permanent Russian settlement in what would be Russian America, Alaska, Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island in 1784, embellishing for whoever might be interested the way that that happened. And in 1786, he went back and he had a meeting with Tsarina Catherine. And he proposed to Tsarina Catherine a vision, a very aggressive and ambitious vision. And that vision would be that its holdings in North America, whatever Russia could get hold of in North America, would become an essential aspect of an economic and political empire that Russia would establish. He saw this as an imperial adventure. Now, reflect for a second that he's an entrepreneur. He's not working on behalf of the government. He's not sanctioned by the government. He's done this on his own. Over the course of the years between when he first attempted to get here in the early 1750s, up until the 1780s when he established that colony, he, in partnership with a number of other entrepreneurs, had been pretty successful. A series of ad hoc ventures. Each voyage was an ad hoc venture. There was no company that oversaw and orchestrated what they were doing. He'd been pretty successful. And so he approaches the Tsarina with this idea. Russia should be in North America. And to flesh out what he would need to make that happen, first of all, he asks for a trade monopoly. He doesn't want competition because it's not cost effective. And what is his grounds for saying, I should have the monopoly? He'd been pretty successful up to that point. He'd actually driven out his primary competitor, Lebedev-Lestachkin, and effectively was taking over everybody else's operations. He wanted a loan. He knew it was going to be an expensive proposition, like anybody else who's attempted any sort of economic development project in Alaska. He wanted naval protection because the situation at the time on the northwest coast was a little bit shaky. Spain was interested. They'd sent a couple of voyages. England was interested, as we know, from Cook and the subsequent Vancouver voyages. And nobody knew how that was going to come out. Nobody knew what the sovereign borders were going to be. And in fact, they wouldn't be determined, as I'm sure most of you know, until 1824 and 1825 in some interesting treaties. He wanted agricultural serfs. He wanted to plant an agricultural colony in order to make the enterprise self-sufficient. Alaskans are still trying to find the agricultural secret that will make Alaska agriculturally self-sufficient. Nobody's been able to figure that one out yet. He wanted an Orthodox mission as well. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he really cared about the souls of the Aleut people that he and his confreres were subjugating at the time. In any case, it looked good to the Tsarina, he thought, to be asking for this Orthodox mission. The prefigure of the decision to sell Russian America in 1867 is contained in the Tsarina's answer. she said no. There were good reasons for her to say no. She knew that Shelikof, like most other people who are pitching a project, was quite capable of exaggerating his capabilities and his achievements for effect. And she didn't know what it might cost. Rather like those people who opposed statehood for Alaska in 1958 in the US Congress, they figured the government would wind up paying a lot of the bill. And as you know, the government does pay a lot of the bill. 1/3 of Alaska's economic base is federal spending. Still today, in 2017, the Tsarina didn't know what it would cost, over what period of time. And she was not anxious to commit financial resources to this dream. Some people at the time called it a pipe dream. She was also very cautious on the political side because, as I have suggested, the contest for sovereignty on the northwest coast among the European powers who had the capability to exercise sovereignty there was just getting underway. And she wasn't sure to what degree she might want to get Russia tangled up in that. There's a very famous incident, for example, of when one of the Spanish voyages came into Cook Inlet in 1793. And there was a Russian naval vessel in Cook Inlet at the time. And the Russians sent notes over to the Spanish inviting them to come and talk, and the Spanish rejected that because they didn't have any authority to talk to the Russians. And they didn't want to get their country involved in a diplomatic exchange for which they would then be held responsible. That's how dicey things were on the northwest coast as this contest for sovereignty is just getting started. And Catherine didn't want any part of that. Subsequent development, I think, would prove her quite correct in that judgment, because when the wars of the French Revolution broke out in 1793, they would consume much of Europe's energy, and Russia would try to stay as far away from it as possible, not entirely successfully, as Napoleon tried to point out. Lucky for the Russians that they kept everybody home instead of dispatching them to North America, where they would not have been too effective in opposing Napoleon, eh? So she probably had good reason to be politically cautious with this vision that Shelikof came and presented to her. So how do we make the connection between her saying no and the 1867 decision to sell? Well, let's look at some different notions of European colonization. Numbers can be helpful. In the middle of the 18th century, 1750s, 1760s, there were 2.5 million British American colonial subjects in North America. 2.5 million on the eve of the American Revolution. And the British had a particular notion of colonialization. It essentially was, we are happy to see you go, we applaud your effort, we're not paying a dime. So it was all in the hands of entrepreneurial companies that could raise money and proprietors who had a claim on some favor from the king. But it was not paid for by the British government, not very much. In subsequent generations in the early 18th century, the British would begin to invest something in a colonial bureaucracy, but not a great deal. But it was, from their point of view, madly successful. 40% of the ships built that were involved in England's transatlantic trade were built in the British American colonies. A huge amount of the trade, that's what the various trade acts were all about. The Sugar Act and the Currency Act and the Stamp Act were about enforcing the British Americans to trade only with England, because that was a huge economic boon to the English, who reaped the benefit of all of that trade. So that's one conception. Let's look at New Spain. In all of the Americas, in about the middle of the 18th century, the Spanish had about 2.5 million Spanish and mixed blood in New Spain, from Mexico all the way to Peru. And they paid for a vast colonial bureaucracy, which exploited the Indians, as we know, but exploited the resources of New Spain in a hugely successful way. The new products that they took into Europe, coffee, chocolate, sugar above all, and tobacco, all of which, by the way, were produced with slave labor, upset the European economy. The economic historians call it a price revolution. So that's another notion of how to do colonies. The French had still another. The French, about 1763, Peace of Paris, had probably 70,000 French up and down the St. Lawrence River. And then the fur trappers spread out across the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi to the mouth of the Missouri and all the way up the Missouri to the Great Falls. I mean, France had people and claims to sovereignty over a vast area of North America. And France didn't pay for very much of a bureaucracy, a little bit, but it encouraged, and the people who were there accepted the encouragement. They intermarried with the indigenous population and came to rely upon the indigenous population, unlike the English, who did not, and unlike the Spanish, who subjugated the indigenous population. As it would happen, in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in America, the French were expelled from North America. They lost all sovereignty. The people were not forced to leave. They stayed, and they would become Quebec. But French sovereignty ended in 1763 as part of that treaty. And then there's the Russian notion of colonization. Largest number of Russians ever in Russian America at any one time. I'm sure some of you know. 550. 550. Svetlana Fedorova says that if you counted California, sometime in the 1850s you got up to 823, but some more recent scholars have challenged that. And Andrei Grinev at the moment seems to have the last word at 550, even if it's 823. It tells us something about the concept of colonization at work. And what is that concept? It is to exploit the resources of that part of North America that Russia can bring under its control, whatever that is, wherever it is, with the least possible expenditure of material, financial, and human resources, as long as it's profitable. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here, because you look around 1867 Sitka, and you see the photographs or the drawings, the engravings of that, and you read the documentary story of that, and you think, oh, colony. And then you think, yeah, well, and there was also a settlement at Kodiak, for heaven's sake. And that's it. That's it. Nor is there anywhere in the documentary evidence any policy judgment that I've ever seen that we are going to use this as the seedbed of something that will grow and grow and grow and become 2.5 million people and become an economic empire and become something competitive with what the British have been doing and what the Spanish have been doing. It ain't there. That's not what we're dealing with. And so what happens? Well, Shelikof, as I'm sure you know, pushed ahead, was reasonably successful. In 1795, he was able to persuade the Tsarina to give him a limited monopoly. Then he died, and then she died in 1796. And the wunderkind Razanov was able to persuade the Tsar, Paul III, to grant this monopoly and form the Russian-American Company. And for the first 20 years, the Russian-American Company kind of bumbled along. The board of directors in St. Petersburg didn't really appreciate the challenges involved. Their rhetoric sounds a great deal like those Alaskans who are always complaining about the federal government misunderstanding Alaska and not expending the right resources and reneging on promises and all of that. I'll come back to that, I think, in a minute. But in the second charter, beginning with Hagemeister's voyage in 1819 and then the promulgation of the second charter in 1821, the Russian Navy takes it over. After 1821, the governor of the colony, the governor of the enterprise on site would always be a naval officer, somebody who knew how to take direction, unlike Alexander Andreevich Baranov. And his tenure would be 5 years and no more, unlike Baranov, who was here for 28 years and generated something of a personality cult. No more of that. Rationalization of this enterprise, which led to a little bit more humane treatment of the natives. We don't want to overdo that, but somewhat. But certainly rationalized what was going on, organized it along the lines of accepted management principles of the time. But always with this notion of what we're doing in mind. We are exploiting the resources of North America that we can bring under our control with the least possible expenditure of material, financial, and human resources, so long as it's profitable. And then comes the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was the embarrassment that Russia hoped to avoid in North America. As you will recall, a combined French-British force opposed Russia's attempt to expand into Danubia, the area in Romania and Hungary today, at the mouth of the Danube River, with the ultimate objective of controlling the Bosporus and the Dardanelles and having access into the Mediterranean, and opposed them successfully. And that was quite remarkable because the Russians are fighting on their homeland. We'll come back to the issue of Crimea perhaps in the end. And the French and the British and whoever else decided to ally with them are fighting a long way from home, and they win. And Russia is forced to accept a treaty that excludes all Russian shipping from the Black Sea. The object being to tie Russia up in Russia and not let it get out and be a threat to the rest of Europe or anybody else. And this is a huge embarrassment for Russia. And during the Crimean War, there was sort of a gentleman's agreement that was never committed to writing, so far as anybody's been able to find, that I know of. But there's a sort of gentleman's agreement that the Bering Sea will be off limits. We're not going to fight. We're not going to send a Russian naval squadron to fight a British naval squadron in the Bering Sea. Okay, if everybody's willing to honor that, what about Sitka, which is nowhere near the Bering Sea? Well, Sitka is vulnerable. And the Russians say, what are we going to do about that? Well, mostly we're going to cross our fingers. And in the end, the crossing of the fingers worked. But not before somebody in the Russian Advisory Council suggests, well, let's do a fake sale. We'll pretend to sell it to the United States. And we'll put an American flag up over Sitka, and the British won't attack them because as of the 1850s, Britain and the United States had a pretty amenable relationship. And then wiser heads decided that this would be far too transparent, it wouldn't work, and they forgot about it. Those of you who have children know better in a careless moment to say chocolate, because it'll come back to haunt you. Mom, you said chocolate. Once you introduce an idea like that, it can take on a life of its own. And this idea began to be talked about. Well, already, even before the Crimean War, there had been people in Russia who said, this is really ridiculous of us to be expending any resources in North America. We have Far East Siberia to develop. And during the Crimean War, lo and behold, a combined French-British naval squadron did attack Petropavlovsk, not once, but twice. They were driven off in 1855 by Prince Maksutov's brother. But in 1856, they came back and overran Petropavlovsk. Then, more wise heads prevailed, and they said, what are we going to do with this? And they gave it back. Logistics issues, supply issues, financial issues. Why do we want it? What's its strategic value? Forget it. But the Russians had discovered, in an attempt to resupply Petropavlovsk from Amuria, from the Amur River, that a threat that the Chinese had made to them a long time before, that if they ever dared show their faces in Amuria, that the Chinese would chase them out, that there weren't any Chinese there. And the Amur River is one of the great rivers of the world. It penetrates a heck of a long way into Asia from the Pacific. And so rational heads in Russia began to talk more fervently about putting Russian resources into Amuria and Far East Siberia instead of in North America. Enter the Americans. The Americans watched all of this. And in 1848, the Americans in war had extended their own empire to the Pacific for the first time. Well, the Oregon Treaty in 1846 is contemporaneous. Contained within that expansion, within the Mexican War, within the acquisition of California, and particularly the Compromise of 1850, which, among other things, makes California a state, contained within that is the reason for the United States acquisition of Alaska. It was, in a word, imperial. The United States forced the Mexican War. It created a border dispute on the Nueces River in Texas, which everybody had agreed would be the boundary. And then the Americans said, oh, no, no, we want the Rio Grande. But the real issue was, we want California. And they took it, not without some expenditure, but they took it. So American officials are watching the Crimean War. They're watching the Russian reaction, and they're certainly watching this idea of a fake sale. In 1859, Secretary of State John Appleton, with the approval of President James Buchanan, gave Senator William Gwin of California permission to raise the possibility of a sale with Edward Stuckel, the Russian minister to the United States, who's been living here a long time. He had an American wife, I think some of you will know. Of course, the American Civil War intervened with any conversations. Well, it didn't stop the discussion in Russia. In 1863, Russia actually approached Britain, not for a sale. Russia wouldn't have sold to Britain, not after the Crimean War. What they approached Britain for was a loan, a big loan. The Russian-American company asked for a big loan because the resources of Russian America were so depleted by 1863. The easily accessible furs are gone. That the government had to subsidize the company for the first time so that the company could pay a dividend. In 1863, the dividend that was paid was 1 ruble 46 kopecks. At the time, that was about the cost of a ordinary watch. So for the first time, the North American enterprise itself didn't generate enough profit to pay a dividend to the stockholders. And for a couple of years thereafter, the government had to subsidize the company. And so now we've got two problems. Problem number one, geopolitical vulnerability. Problem number two, it's starting to cost money. So the third chart of the Russian-American company is due to expire in 1864, and the company and the government send out a survey team, normal thing that they did at the end of any of the charters, to assess what the status of Russian America is, what's going on. Reports written by a naval captain named Peter Golovin. Now, what Golovin says is, this isn't profitable anymore, this enterprise. And in order to make it profitable, somebody's going to have to inject a great deal of money, and the company's going to have to be reorganized because the company is not operating efficiently. That's it. He doesn't recommend anything. That wasn't his job. But the report is damning. It's absolutely damning. By this time, the Russians have tried a lot of things besides fur. They tried coal mining on the Kenai Peninsula, and they actually shipped coal to California the first couple of years of the gold rush, but then there was better coal available much closer, and that ended that. They tried whaling, but they never put enough money into it. They had a Finnish whaling company under contract to the Russian-American company, and they botched that effort. which is a little bit hard to imagine given all the whaling that was going on in the Bering Sea in the 1840s and 50s, but they didn't pull it off. They actually did some gold prospecting, and they found gold in Resurrection Creek on Kenai Peninsula, but not enough to justify the expenditure that it would take to make it commercially profitable. So now the Russian Senate makes up its mind. We're going to unload this thing. What we need to understand is it was a business decision, and it was not a careless business decision. The Russians knew what they had. They knew what the resources were. They knew what the potential was. They also knew it would cost far more than would be consistent with the long-term management policy of this enterprise in order to make it profitable again. And so they were ready. The table was set. For whom? Well, as we know, Mr. Seward. Let's examine Mr. Seward for a moment. Throughout his career, he is an expansionist, an imperialist. What does imperial mean? He wants to establish an American economic empire. He wants to take advantage of California and establish trade for American products, agricultural and manufactured, in the Orient. He said, for example, at one point, the commerce of the world is the empire of the world. So he wanted whatever would facilitate the expansion of an American economic empire. What might that be? Here comes Alaska, 1867. Perfect place for a coaling station. You could ship coal up and warehouse it. Watering station. Ships always need fresh water. Provisioning place, both such things as masts and tar on the one hand and non-perishable foodstuffs on the other. For ships transiting the North Pacific. He also wanted Hawaii, and he got, in 1867, the same year as Alaska, he got Midway Island through a very interesting little treaty called the Guano Treaty, which allowed powers to appropriate island properties that were rich in guano, and the United States used that instrument to establish their sovereignty over Midway Island. He also wanted on the Atlantic side Greenland and St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands. Well, if you think about it, he got all four of them eventually. I mean, the United States got Alaska. It eventually got, through the coup in 1898, Hawaii. It got St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands in 1916 by purchase. And for all practical intent and purpose, with the 99-year lease on Thule Air Base and the other military facilities in Greenland, we've got Greenland. I mean, not too bad a vision. And Seward is a visionary just like Shelikof. And what is his vision? An American economic empire. Throughout his life, he spoke the language of exuberant expansion. And of course, Alaska's an integral part of that vision. Now, reflect for a second. He doesn't know much about Alaska. He doesn't know its internal prospects. He just assumes, well, it's like California. I mean, a little colder in the winter maybe, but it's got resources. He did not have any detailed notion of what those resources were. His vision is geopolitical and geoeconomic, and Alaska is a piece of that vision. So, March 30, they write this treaty in the middle of the night. And the reason why was because Congress, the Senate was due to adjourn the next day, and he wanted to get it approved by the Senate before they adjourned. That was naive on his part. And at the last moment, he called up the guy he needed to talk to. Let's see if we can get him here. Oh, there we go. Charles Sumner. Now, you know how parliamentary procedure works. You don't just walk into the body one day and say, I have a bill, let's vote on it. Parliamentary bodies have standing committees, Ways and Means and Defense and whatever, Interior. And it's got one on called Foreign Relations. So this treaty is going to go to the Foreign Relations Committee. Why is it going to go there? The same reason any bill goes to committee right away whenever it's introduced, so that somebody can take a serious look at it, can study it, hold hearings if necessary, and the committee then can make an informed decision whether or not to recommend to the whole body that this thing be approved or not approved. Who's chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Charles Sumner. Do Senate committees act over the wishes of their chair? No. It almost never happens, and when it does happen, it's revolutionary. That's how significant Charles Sumner is to the acquisition of Alaska. No Sumner, no Alaska for the United States, at least not in 1867. So what happens? Sumner is a brilliant guy. He speaks 5 languages. Some of you will know that he was almost clubbed to death on the floor of the Senate in 1858 after he made a very fiery abolitionist speech. It took him 3 years to recover. He was a large man, big man. He called for everything that the Smithsonian Institution and the Library of Congress had on Russian America. And there was a lot. There had been 60 voyages, official voyages, between 1741 and 1867 from Russia to Russian America to North America, and virtually every one of them had carried scientists, and all the scientists had written reports, and all those reports were available. Sumner didn't speak Russian, so he had translators translate this stuff so he could read it. And he persuaded himself that internally Alaska was valuable. He agreed with Seward. He too was an expansionist. He absolutely agreed with Seward. Yes, we need this on geopolitical and geoeconomic grounds. He also had another idea. He believed deeply in democracy, and he said if we get Russia off of the continent, then we preserve one more area of the continent for democratic institutions instead of autocratic institutions. But he also brought himself to understand what Alaska's interior potential was. He persuaded his committee. The committee sent the treaty out to the Senate with a do-pass recommendation, and then he gives on the Senate floor a 3-hour extemporaneous speech extolling Alaska. It wasn't recorded. Some months later, he made notes available to the Senate scribe who made up a speech, and that's the one you find in the congressional record. But there's enough in those notes to tell us what he was talking about. And he understood the fishery potential. He understood the timber potential. He understood that there was probably more fur potential if the United States would undertake to discover what those resources were, which it would do in the 1880s with the expeditions of people like Abercrombie and Allen and the others. And so the Senate voted. Now, there was a preliminary vote of whether or not to vote on the treaty. That this was a test vote. This often happens in parliamentary bodies to figure out where people are. You don't want to be voting on the wrong side of an issue, if you can help it. And that vote came out 26-12. So if you do the math, that just by one vote makes the necessary 2/3 majority. Because if you do the decimal points, it's would have been 25 needed. So then the Senate votes. And how do they vote? 37-2 to ratify the Alaska Treaty. Okay, so America is off on its imperial adventure, now away from the contiguous states. And that brings up a lot of issues that will plague the Alaska-U.S. relationship in future, which I don't want to take time with now. What about Seward's Folly? Icebergia, Walrussia, all of this stuff that supposedly demonstrates that the purchase was not popular. Scholars did away with that canard ages and ages ago. The foremost U.S. diplomatic historian of the first half of the 20th century, Thomas A. Bailey, wrote an excellent article exposing the falsity of the idea that the Alaska Purchase was not popular. In 1958, a journalism scholar down in California did an article in which he surveyed the 48 major American newspapers being published in 1867. 44 of them approved the purchase editorially. So where does this Seward's Folly stuff come from? Why does it perpetuate? Well, there are three explanations. The first one is that the folks who write U.S. history textbooks don't have time to do all of their own research, so they rely on other people who've done research. And when they get to an issue that doesn't seem to be all that important, not like a world war or something, like the purchase of Alaska, they don't spend a lot of time on it. So that's explanation one. That's Bailey's explanation. Explanation two, it didn't last very long, this unpopularity. There were some editorials that were critical, but by the time in July, so 6 or 8 weeks after March 30th, that the treaty was voted on, newspaper editors around the country had the opportunity to become informed. And that's why 44 of 48 of them supported the purchase. So there was a Seward's Folly, but it was an initial reaction before people had time to figure it out. There's another explanation. Victimhood fits Alaska. Alaskans are always crying, oh, we're a victim of the federal government. We're a victim. People in Washington don't understand us. The people of the United States don't understand us. We're different from everybody else. And there's a fourth explanation, which is sort of related to that, which is that Americans don't like to think of themselves as imperialists. It doesn't wash well with democracy and inclusion and equality. So all of these things combined have kept this mythology alive. It's quite remarkable. I find it quite interesting. There may be a new scholarly article coming out shortly that will make another stab at dispensing with this mythology. I'd like to make two more quick points before concluding. What about the Tlingit reaction? A great deal has been made of this recently and will continue to be. This sesquicentennial is in some very important ways the native sesquicentennial. And I think that we should applaud that. But let's don't make a mistake. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Okay? It's completely unreasonable and anachronistic to think that anybody in the United States or in Russia, in mainstream culture, would have for one moment considered the Tlingit claim of ownership to Russian America or the Alexander Archipelago or any part of it seriously. That isn't the way people fought in 1867. It would have accorded a legitimacy, a dignity, an equality to indigenous people that simply was not in the vocabulary or the psychology of people running the world or the country in 1867. Sure, there were a couple of people, like Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spaniard who challenged the Spanish assertion of the right to subjugate the indigenous of the Americas. But those are voices in the wilderness of mainstream culture. So what does this teach us? It teaches that culture evolves. It's dynamic. It's constantly changing. So when do we begin to take seriously the Tlingit reaction? And what can be done about it? Well, it begins to be taken seriously after the United States Supreme Court in 1941 finds for the first time for the validity of something called aboriginal title. What's aboriginal title? Aboriginal title, the Supreme Court says, is title to land that indigenous people have ever utilized and occupied, whether they continue to utilize and occupy it now or not, unless it's been formally extinguished by the U.S. Congress. And in 1947, the Tlingit Haida suit, land suit for the Alexander Archipelago, based on clan property rights, is filed in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And in 1959, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims finds, guess what? Yes, Tlingit and Haida people did own the Alexander Archipelago in 1867, and so Russia had no right to sell it, and the United States had no right to purchase it. That's a legal decision in 1959. When is 1959? 1959 is 5 years after Brown versus Board of Education. It's the beginning of the civil rights movement. The culture is changing. Cultures are dynamic. And so this is appropriately, in my view, the indigenous sesquicentennial in Alaska. We can now talk about this. We can raise this up and address it and treat it fairly and with legitimacy. I want to make one more point. I think that the most significant legacy of the Alaska Purchase is the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. How do I put that together? As you all know, Congress did not act in 1867 to dispose of Alaska's land. What does that mean, dispose of it? To determine how it would be used. Who would have jurisdiction over various pieces of it? It put that off. Put it off for good reason. Congress didn't know enough about Alaska. And there was the issue of what is the nature of the indigenous population and what rights might they have. And Congress kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. There was no disposal of Alaska land by the United States Congress, with the exception of a few small pieces of Tongass National Forest, well, not so small at 18 million acres, Chugach National Forest, Mount McKinley National Park, Glacier Bay National Monument, Katmai National Monument, Petroleum Reserve Number 4, 54 million acres before statehood, out of 375 million. So you still got 320 million to deal with. What are we going to do with it? Congress can't decide. Finally, in 1958, statehood, 104 million acres. Okay, now reflect on this. How do we extinguish Aboriginal title? How does Congress do it? It did it by treaty, Indian treaties. That's what Indian treaties are all about. You draw a box, You put all the Indians in it that you can find. The United States holds the land inside the box, which is called a reservation, in trust, and it extinguishes title to everything outside the treaty box. That's what Indian treaties are. That's what they do. And that's the end of Aboriginal title. Been extinguished. Congress stopped treaty making in 1871. Has to do with the Civil War. So no treaties were ever made with Alaska Native people. So no extinguishment of title until 1971, when 44 million acres of Alaska land are titled to Alaska Natives, and native title, Aboriginal title to all the rest is extinguished formally by the United States Congress. I'd call that one hell of a legacy, eh? Well, I have gone on far too long. So let me summarize this way, if I can find my summary note. And I'd be delighted to handle any questions or observations or complaints you may have. So when a Siberian line battalion and a detachment of U.S. Army 9th Infantry drew up in front of the governor's house on April 18, 1867, they carried with them a lot more weight than any of them could realize. The weight of history and the weight of the future. It's our privilege to lift some of that weight from their shoulders and see what it amounts to. I hope this excursion into the Sesquicentennial will be helpful in that pursuit. Thank you very much.
That was truly wonderful, Dr. Haig Hawks, and we just hope that we can hear you again. And it's an open invitation to come to Sitka for Alaska Day, for Alaska Week festivities. We'd really like to have you, and hopefully we can do some neat things there. Dr. Haig Hawks will be here for questions for the audience afterwards. And before that, I'd like to introduce some guests we have from Riga, Latvia. And this person has quite a connection to some of the things that Steve talked about. Olga and Valentine Bornikov, would you please stand up? Valentine. And it's Olga, he's his daughter. Valentine's great-grandfather was a Finnish sea captain that was commissioned by Catherine the Great to sail the Juno to Sitka. And many of you will know of the Juno and the Avos. Avos was the first ship that was actually built in Sitka. And he went on to sail with the Juno and the Avos down to Fort Ross. As well, his great-grandfather, the Finn, Christian Benjamin, married a Russian Orthodox priest's daughter of a marriage with a Tlingit woman. So he married a Creole, and you're the descendants of them. They had 12 children. Of those 12 children, one of them, what was his name? Nicholas Benjamin was the navigator to take the Russians who chose not to stay in Sitka home after the transfer. So that was his great-grandfather. So they are here kind of researching and learning about Sitka, and it's been really a pleasure to have them. And so I think that, we've got all of history kind of coming in together here in Sitka, and it's really just a cool place. So once again, thank you for coming, and hope folks get time to And Jeff, when's the next? The next one is what?
May 14th.
June 14th.
Mike Dunham here, and then the on Washington crossing the Delaware, and Mr. Dunham will be down here talking about, he just wrote 2 books, The Man Who Sold Alaska and The Man Who Bought Alaska.
And by the way, these are brought to you by the combined effort of the Sitka National Historic Park and the Sitka Historical Society and Museum. So, anyway, yes, please.
If people want to wait, I've got 5 more interesting minutes.
Anybody want to hear 5 more interesting minutes? All right.
Well, I need a little, thank you so much. I'll need a little help with this, I think. Oops, got to go back. I'm sure that there's somebody here who can translate that. This is a monument which was erected in a Crimean port town on the Black Sea a few years ago. I wrote a column about this in the Daily News, in the Dispatch. I'll just read the first part of it. And here's how it goes. And then we'll get a translation. I have been told what this says, and I can give my version, and anybody, Russian speakers who are here can correct that. So here's what the column said. Russia did not sell Alaska to the United States in 1867. The Russian government only leased the region to the U.S. for an indefinite span of time. Now there are many in Russia who think the span has run its course, and they want Alaska back. Tsar Alexander II, who orchestrated the sale of Russian America, was a mean-spirited and corrupt liberal whose weak mind was captured by a Jewish capitalist cabal bent on stripping Russia of its historic lands in Europe and in America. The bomb that killed him in 1881 struck a righteous blow for the Russian motherland. The Russian fur trappers who first encountered the natives of Alaska in the Aleutians and later in the Alexander Archipelago treated them with compassion and benevolence, nurturing their values while at the same time teaching them the beneficence of Russian culture and civilization, unlike the Americans later who used every method to destroy native culture and make Alaska victims of capitalist exploitation. Such resistance as the Russians encountered from the natives was instigated by the Americans, who supplied them with guns and alcohol for the sole purpose of demoralizing and incapacitating them. The natives were too incompetent to fend for themselves, and only the instruction and leadership they received from the Russians allowed them to survive and ultimately prosper as they did under Russian tutelage. The history of Alaska, as written by Americans, is a calculated distortion of the historical reality written by capitalist lackeys. The Russian people today call upon their government to take back Russia's rightful historic homelands, of which Russian America was an integral part. In virtually any train or bus station in Russia today, in sidewalk kiosks, in bookstores, in libraries, one finds this representation of Alaska and the sale of Russian America at every hand. In purported histories, in novels, in feature articles, a story of Russia betrayed. It's a favorite theme of extreme Russian nationalists. It plays well in Russia today, where the ruling oligarchy's wealth and power has led to confusion and instability and crushed the promise of freedom and widespread economic opportunity so hoped for after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As portrayed by the 2015 Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich, who has written extensively about post-Soviet Russia, countless Russians today blame Gorbachev and Yeltsin for the chaos in Russia and long for the stability and reliability of Stalinist Russia, where despite deprivation and fear, life was predictable. Comparisons of the treason of 1991 with the treason of 1867 are common, and nostalgic Russian patriots eagerly consume stories of the Russian motherland deceived and the Russian soul betrayed. And the translation, I am told, of this, across the top it says, to future Russians. The second line, we recovered Crimea, you bring back Alaska. Thank you. Is that fun? It's in a port town in Crimea.
question?
Certainly, of course.
I was wondering how the Russians, controlled all of Russia, I mean, all of Alaska from Sitka, and then how did the Americans control all of Alaska from Juneau?
Yeah. Well, control perhaps is the operative word. And in fact, the Russians didn't control. First of all, the Russians didn't penetrate the interior very much. They did not, for example, get up the rivers out of Cook Inlet. They didn't get over the mountains adjacent to the Alexander Archipelago. They did get about 500 miles up the Yukon River fairly late, the 1840s. But generally speaking, they simply dealt with the coastal areas that were easily approachable by sea. And they did not necessarily control them. In point of fact, the stockade that was around Sitka here was meant to keep the Tlingit out. Some of the Russian priests taught the Tlingit how to grow potatoes. And so the Tlingit grew a lot of potatoes. And the Russians became dependent upon those potatoes. Fish is wonderful. It's day after day, week after week, year after year. The diet would like to have something else. And the Tlingit traded potatoes and deer skins to the Russians here at Sitka. And the Russians became dependent upon the Tlingit. Also, the Russians couldn't send the detachments out of the stockade at Sitka for very far without fear of being attacked by the Tlingit. As late as 1856, the Tlingit had prepared a major attack against Sitka, and they were betrayed at the last moment by some Tlingit who were favorable to the Russians or who didn't want to see their relatives get slaughtered. And so the attack never came off. So control, I think, in this case is the operative word. In terms of the American jurisdiction over Alaska, it's not all that dissimilar. And a great deal rests on the threat of force. The bottom line, and John Marshall in some very important Supreme Court cases in the 1830s laid this out. He says colonialization rests ultimately on the threat of conquest. And so the conquest doesn't have to be complete. You don't actually have to have soldiers every place. The very threat that you could have and that you could deploy that force when and where you might need it is sufficient, is enough in most cases. And when it's not sufficient, you deploy the force. So I think that really is the issue. What do we mean by control, and how is control implemented, eh? Rich?
Steve, I've read Canadian authors who have said that the purchase of Alaska was a part of a scheme to grab Western Canada from Britain and tack it onto the United States as an extension of Manifest Destiny.
Sure.
Do you put any stock in that?
Well, it's really interesting. I just did some new research on that. Not my own research, but looking at research that has been done. There was a chap down at the University of Washington who did quite a bit of work on this some years ago. And there was, in fact, an annexation movement in the British Columbia colony, which the British were very afraid of. But there's another point that's really very interesting. In 1867, when the Dominion of Canada was created out of East and West Canada, and
Between the treaty and the accession.
that's right, that's exactly right. And at the time, two things were going on in Britain. Number one was a debt crisis. They didn't have any money. And the second one was there was a small England movement that we really don't want to be imperial. See, this is a long time before India and the British Empire. And there was a small England movement. And this one researcher at the University of Washington, Richard Neunhertz, found correspondence suggesting that if the United States had made an offer for British Columbia, the Brits would have taken it. The Brits did not want Canada because it was costly. They didn't want a dominion of Canada. They wanted an independent country. And so there's balance there. What this researcher found in British Columbia was that there was a strong annexation movement, but there was a stronger, let's stay in the Dominion movement. So it's a great question, and there's still research going on that question. Bruce?
Yes, Steve. A kind of a similar question. Yeah, I read that the sale of Alaska on the Russian side tended to undermine the authority and the respect for the Tsar. Have you found any support for that theory?
I would be skeptical of that. I'm not a Russianist. I mean, I've read a lot of Russian history, but I'm not a Russianist, and I would really want a Russianist to answer that question. But I think not. I have a very good friend, Andrei Znamensky, who has studied this a lot. And his view is that Russian America was really an afterthought for Alexander. That this is just, it's just too far away. It's just too hard to supply. It's just too, it's too out there, ethereal, to take too seriously. And his conclusion is that that same sentiment, that this is kind of an exotic that we really don't know anything about and don't take too seriously, played in the Russian intelligentsia as well. But again, I think it really takes a Russianist to address that question. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, that's a good question. The bottom line answer to that is.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. The question was, how was the price of 7.2 million determined? Who came up with that, and where did it come from? The bottom line answer on that is what everybody thought the traffic would bear. The initial evaluation came from the Russians, and the offer was 5 million. But then when the Senate, and that was in 1859, but then when the Senate met in 1863 and again in 1864, they pushed it up to 7 million. And then the 200,000 was added as a bonus, effectively, for Steckel. And so that's how they came up with the 7.2. Yeah. Now, a lot of people have sort of taken an affection to the 2 cents an acre bit. But if you think about it, how do you assess something like that? Where's the valuation come from? I mean, this is really a political question. It really doesn't really have anything to do with the value of the real estate. Yeah. Sir?
Those old Alaskan sportsmen, you know, the old Wickstrom, and in that they stated there was 2 checks. One was drawn before the Civil War and laid in the Treasury, and then they bumped it up to make up for the Russian fleet showing its flag to prevent Britain from going with Dixie, and that the Russians had to be reimbursed for their costs of sending their fleet to San Francisco.
I'm familiar with those stories, and they are stories. The research won't support that. I mean, it's fun, it's neat, but it's been researched meticulously because people. And there's a terrific book. The best book on this, it was done by a diplomatic historian at the University of Oregon many, many years ago. It's called Tarnished Expansion by a guy named Paul Holbo. But a number of scholars have gone into this, and the record of the draw on the Treasury and the gold and where it went and how it was paid is comprehensively and thoroughly documented. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I read where that certain members of our legislature were bribed to vote in favor of the state.
Yeah, right. And that gets us into modern politics. What's a bribe? It's possible. It's just possible. Did you see now I can't think of the name of the film, the film on Lincoln and the 13th Amendment, getting the 13th Amendment through the Congress? There are a lot of ways of putting pressure on senators. It probably wasn't necessary. Certainly Seward took a lot of people to dinner. Certainly newspaper people had a lot of dinners with lobbyists and then wrote positive editorials. Was there bribery afoot? Nobody has ever conclusively demonstrated any bribery, and that too has been researched meticulously. At one point, one of Andrew Johnson, the president's advisors, while being taken home in a hansom cab one night after a night of heavy drinking, said something about bribes. That's the closest the documentation has come yet. Not too reliable, but good question. Yes, Nancy.
Dr. Hayxoc, thank you for coming and you speak in paragraphs. And I've watched your career since we both moved from community college to senior college in that fateful year of 1972. And you've had a remarkable career. Now I have a chance to read your material. And what are the names of your books? And what, pray tell, are you working on now?
My goodness. Well, thank you very much, Nancy. Nancy's been a dear friend from the days when we were colleagues in an early version of University of Alaska Anchorage, and I have valued her friendship all of these years. The book that probably is most useful is a narrative history of Alaska that I wrote 15 years ago called Alaska, an American Colony. It relies heavily on an economic history and profile of Alaska. I have a new book that was published just a year ago called Battleground Alaska, Fighting Federal Power in America's Last Wilderness, and it lays out the falsity of the claim that the federal government has reneged on promises made at statehood and that there is somehow an inviolable statehood compact. But that's enough about me. I came to talk about the Sesquicentennial. Thank you so very much for your attention. It's a joy to be here.
Thanks a million. Yeah, that was great. Yeah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. How are you? I know.